Hello, guys. Welcome to this story. I'm going to tell you a story about Florida. There's sinkholes in Florida. Let me tell you a little story. There was a dry spell in Florida. Lasted quite a little while, and I was just a kid. I must have only been about, I don't know, maybe 10 years old. And I used to like to play around in the yard. And one of the things I like to do is a silly thing I like to do. But listen. There's sand in Florida. How the sand is you ever seen powdered sugar? The sand in Florida looks like powdered sugar. And wherever you dig in Central Florida, around Central Florida, you run into this powdered sugar sand. It's like, if you dig down about 7 or 8 feet in it, oh, by the way, it's awful easy digging in it, If you dig down in it and you get down about 7 or 8 feet deep, you start to hit a little bit of an orange-colored powdered sand. It's the same powdered sand, but it's like an orangish colored, It's still easy digging. There's no rocks anywhere. You will not find a rock. All you find is this sand everywhere, sand. Powdered like white, fine sand. And when this sand gets wet, it compacts down hard. But when the sand gets dry, it turns to light, fluffy, like powdery, it's almost like powdered sugar. And the roads down there, a lot of them, are made of the sand. They just basically make a road over top of this sand. And unlike mud, you know how mud is? A mud road like we have up in the north, if you have a dirt road here in the north, there's mud, and when it gets wet out, it gets slippery and your car might get stuck on a mud road in the north. Well, this sand is exactly the opposite. This sand gets slippery and gets so that you can't drive on it or you'll get stuck. Not when it's wet out, but when it's dry. When it gets dry, the sand gets fluffy and light, and your car will get stuck in it, So there's just sand everywhere, this white powdery sand in Central Florida. When it rains, the sand gets compacted down nice and solid, but when it gets dry, it gets soft. The sand starts to get soft and powdery. And so I used to know a well driller, and he told me stories, how they drill wells in Florida. It's quite similar to the way wells are drilled in the north. They take a pipe and they pound it down using water pressure and stuff. And he told me that when he goes down about 60 feet deep underneath the powdered sand, this layer of powdered sand, he brings up stuff like seashells. That's right, down 60 feet deep underneath the powdered sand. And evidently, there's these things called sinkholes that occur. So what you have is when you go down 60 feet deep underneath this layer of powdered sand down there in Florida, you hit an old coral reef. And that old coral reef has turned into a porous layer of limestone. That's what it's turned into. And the water in this porous layer of limestone, it's like if you went down there and you were to look at it, if you were to have some sort of a submersible or something that you could sink down in there and go down beneath this layer of sand and look at it with a camera, what you'd see is all these old limestone, this porous limestone everywhere that's like a sponge and it holds water. And this water is the freshest water on earth. It's called an aquifer. So they drain this water out to pump for places like, in Florida, for places like golf courses and stuff. They put wells down into the aquifer, and they suck this water up, this layer of water that's down there in this ancient coral reef. And they pump it out, the water. Well, after they pump sufficient amounts of this water out, the coral down in there gets empty, it gets dry down in there, and it makes like a cavernous area. Now, of course, you have this dry powderous sand layer on top of that, which is about 60 feet deep. And so what happens is obviously the sand just falls down into the coral layer and creates what's called a sinkhole. So when I was a kid, we had this dry spell, And I had this thing I like to do with the water hose, you know. I turn the water hose on in front of the house, and I'd get the water hose, and I'd start pushing it down into the sand. And, of course, the sand would bubble up around the water hose, you know, and the water hose would go deeper and deeper and deeper down in the sand. And I used to like to play this game where I'd see how deep I could get the tip of the water hose to go down into the sand, you know. And oftentimes I was able to get it to go down about 10 feet deep, maybe even 15 feet deep. You know, and then I'd pull the water hose up. A couple times I almost got the water hose stuck down there, you know. I had to pull so hard to try to get it up out one time that you know, that little tip that's on the end of the water hose where you screw it on to that tip broke off, and all it came up was because I had it so deep into the sand, you know, using the water pressure to help it go down. Anyway, I used to do stuff like that when I was a kid, you know, little experiments and stuff. So, you know, I dragged the water hose out to the back of the house as far as the water hose would reach, and it was halfway off to the neighbor's house down there, and I started drilling one of these holes as a kid, you know. And honest to God, I'm going to tell you what happened. I made a sinkhole, albeit a tiny one. All of a sudden, the ground underneath, it just, underneath where I was drilling, it just went sloop, gone. And it made a hole about 6 inches in diameter, and there was nothing down in the bottom of that hole. So I got up to the edge of it, and I looked down in there. Couldn't see nothing. Reached my arm down in there, you know, and the hole was about 6 inches in diameter. It was a little bit bigger than my arm. Reached my arm down there, wiggled my arm around. It was hollow down in there. So I walked back up to the house, and I got a couple little rocks that was in the driveway of the house. Now, if you're going to get rocks in Florida, you have to have them delivered. My dad brought rocks in for the driveway, but there's these little pebbles. They were about an inch in diameter. They were little rocks that he'd bought. You know, he bought bags of them. You know. And they cost like $1 a bag or whatever, or a 50-pound bag of rocks, and you'd sprinkle them in around the driveway. But there's the only rocks around. So I grabbed a handful of these rocks, started waltzing out to the backyard where I drilled this hole. You know? And everything was nice and quiet. Couldn't hear anything. I dropped one of the rocks, and it fell down in there. And I couldn't hear it hit bottom. Now, in truth, other sinkholes had developed during this same dry spell. There was one over in Deltona, and me and my dad had visited it, you know. And it had been, what had happened was the sinkhole was this nice house they built on the golf course, you know. And the sinkhole was under half of the house. And what happened was that half of the house, it fell down into the hole, some 75 feet deep, before it hit bottom. So half of the house was down in the hole, and the other half of the house was up on the ground, and there was wires that were pulled down, like the electrical wires had been pulled down into the hole, but you could see, it looked like a cutaway house. Like you could see into the bedroom and into the bathroom, into the living room. You know, the other half of the house was down in the hole, and everybody was standing around the hole, and the county was coming in there, filling this hole just as damn as fast well as they could. They bringing dump trucks in and pouring the fill in just as fast as they could, filling the hole up. Me and my dad were there looking down into the hole. Must have been 75 or 80 feet deep, you know. And there was a car down in there from his garage side of the house that fell down to the hole. There was a couple cars down in there, brand new cars down in there, and there's all kinds of stuff, and half of the house was gone down to the hole. And so we watched this there filming it. And the hole had just appeared that morning, you know, and we were one of the people, the spectators, you know. Actually, knowing what I know now, I would never get that close to the edge of that hole. But anyway, this was a little sinkhole that appeared in our backyard. But it wasn't nothing the size of that hole that had consumed that house, you know. This was only a little one, little tiny one, you know. But it was my sinkhole. I had made it. It couldn't have been any more than 6 inches in diameter. Now, I'll tell you the story of what happened with that sinkhole. It stopped. It never got any bigger. It just was 6 inches in diameter. But I think it was just as deep as that one in Deltona. I think it was probably 75 or 80 feet deep. And when I dropped those little stones down in there, I think they were falling 75 or 80 feet down into that thing. And I made it with that garden hose. So that's just a little interesting sub-story, that was a long time ago. I couldn't have been any more. I was a real kid, just a kid, So I thought you guys would find that interesting. So Florida is this way. There's this layer of sand all down through central Florida. Now, Florida is a peninsula. It extends all the way down to the Florida Keys, and it goes all the way up to where about the what's called the Panhandle, up near the Tallahassee region, which is the Florida state capital. And I lived there, in Tallahassee when I was a kid for a year or two, I lived in Tallahassee. It's funny, I had a teacher in Tallahassee. She was called Mrs. Skinner, Now, I was a Jehovah's Witness kid back in those days. And I'm going to tell you something about that. Kids in the school, they hate Jehovah's Witness kids. And the reason why? Is because their parents tell them stuff. And the reason goes back to something very simple that everybody can understand. Most times, kids' parents work. And they work hard for their money, They get up at 8 o'clock or 7 o'clock to get into work. Some of them have to get up at 6 o'clock to get into work. Some of them work, it depends on how far they have to drive or whatever, And so all week long they work really hard, and they might work a 40, 50, 60-hour work week, and they look forward to the weekend. Even when Friday's there, they're all excited. Oh, I get the weekend. I'm going to get to sleep in tomorrow morning, So they're all happy and everything, right? So they go to bed Friday night, looking forward to sleeping in till 11 o'clock the next morning, and catching up on their rest. And so about 7 o'clock in the morning, now this is years ago. This doesn't happen so much anymore, but back then, back years ago, they would go to bed that night and wait, looking forward to sleeping in the next morning, the parents, and they'd be cozy in their bed, nice and warm and everything. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, or maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, they hear this rapping on the door, like a... They roll over in bed, Oh. And then a minute later, bang, 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 again on the door, So finally, they get up out of bed and they put their bathrobe on or whatever, and they slip on their slippers and they go out, and somebody's woken them up from their. Finally, they got a morning they can sleep Saturday morning. Somebody's woken them up. And they're mad. They're mad because, they want to sleep in. It's their only morning they get, right? So they go crawling out of the bedroom, crawling out to the front, and then they see they can see behind the curtains or behind the window. It's the Jehovah's Witnesses. So they go and they hide in the kitchen. And the Jehovah's Witnesses rap on the door again. Finally, after about 5 minutes, they leave. And they walk out and they leave, So this guy, they woken up and... they're upset, Even though they didn't answer the door, they're upset. They're like, why did they wake me up by one morning to sleep? And so, the kids get up later to watch the Saturday morning cartoons, because that used to be a thing back in those years, Saturday morning cartoons. And here's their parents walking around the house, eating their toast, and saying, "Those some Jehovah's Witnesses were there again this morning, they woke me up again." And they're raging, And the kids hear all that. So the kids think to themselves, what is this Jehovah's Witnesses? And they hear their parents raging about the Jehovah's Witnesses, how awful they are. Oh, they woke me up again this Saturday. Can't those people leave me alone and everything else, right? And so what happens is then the kid goes to school. And he finds out there's another kid in the school that's a Jehovah's Witness. He says, I know who they are. My parents hate their guts because they wake them up every Saturday morning. And it kind of reflects off on the kid. And then the kid says to himself, well, I hate them too. I don't know why I hate them, but I hate them too. And there's a Jehovah's Witness kid, you know. So I used to go to school, and all the other kids do. I was a Jehovah's Witness kid. Well, you can just imagine how it's going to work out for me. Anyway, in a new school too, you know. So anyway, here I was, and I had this Mrs. Skinner. And I don't know, it was third grade, okay? I was in Tallahassee. Mrs. Skinner. She wasn't called Mrs. Skinner for nothing. You know? She had this thing, she picked on me. I don't know whether I was a Jehovah's Witness kid or what. Not just all the other kids, but this Mrs. Skinner liked to pick on me too, you know. Miserable. Miserable. And so I was in class, you know, and it was always like, she was always calling my mother. He's not doing his homework properly. He's not attentive in class today. And always blaming my mother, too. Like, you gotta manage him more properly, you know, and all this kind of stuff. And just constantly berating my mother, you know, about me, you know. He's the worst kid in my class. He doesn't pay attention. Blah, 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 blah. Mrs. Skinner. Anyway. So, third grade wasn't that great in Tallahassee for me. But there was some perks, you know. That's the year I got the yellow bicycle. The yellow bicycle was great. The yellow bicycle with the banana seat. You know, I had it for quite a few years. The best bicycle. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story about that bike. When my father got that bike, you know. My dad, he's a mild-mannered man. But he's very protective of his family. In fact, he's overprotective of his kids, you know. So, here's the thing. Him and my mother, they knew I wanted a bicycle really bad. So, they went to Sears. And they spotted this bicycle was on sale for like half price. Because it was a funny bicycle. It was like, had long handlebars, long banana seat on it. And it was like, just a weird bike, you know. And they were doing them on a clear out sale or whatever, like, you know, for sale, you know. And my dad decided to get me this bike. So my dad was all excited about getting me this bike. He brought the big box home and he laid it out in the living room. And he got all of his tools that he needed that said in the manual and everything. And he started to put this bicycle together. And he did an excellent job because my dad was an excellent mechanic, you know, and good at mechanical stuff. He did an excellent job. He did it according to specs, put everything together. I mean, he even tightened the bolts according to the right foot-pounds per square inch and all that. You know, he oiled the parts, you know, and put it all together properly and everything. So he took it out in the driveway. Come on, testify. I was all excited, you know. Got on the back of the bicycle and wanted to give it a test, you know. So he was playing with this bicycle. Well, it took him a little while, but he discovered, after he was teaching me how to ride it, he discovered that the brake didn't work properly. Now, I had one of those brakes. It didn't have the caliper brakes that go on the front wheel, you know, like, and the back wheel, like, that you pull a handle, you know, and the caliper brakes. It didn't have those. This was a bicycle that had a brake that was on the pedal. You push the pedal backwards, and it would make the bike brake, you know. So, he discovered the brake didn't work at all. And because he's extremely protective, you know, he says, this is a brand new bicycle. And he said, he went to my mother, and he's standing there, his hand was waving. He started to get excited. He says, this is a brand new bicycle they sold us, and it's got a defaulty brake. Can you imagine? Some poor kid goes out and tries to stop, and he gets run over by a truck, he says. And he was all excited and mad, you know. My mother says, well, listen, it's a brand new bicycle. We got the receipt right here. We'll take it back, you know. So my father says, yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll take it back. He says, we'll take it back to Sears. So two of them hopped in the car, and I hopped in the back seat. And the car was one of these big old Chevys, and it was called a Chevy 2. And I think it had a 327 cubic inch engine in it. Had a big, long bench seat in the back. The car was blue. And I used to love to ride in that car because I had the entire bench seat all to myself. I mean, it was like I could stretch out when I was a kid, and there would still be a foot distance between my feet and the other door. I could just stretch right out, lay right out the back, you know. My parents were driving up in front through Tallahassee, heading to Sears, and I was stretched out across the back seat, you know. So I landed there at Sears and went in with my parents. And the guy was there that worked in that department, in the toy department or wherever they sold the bicycles. And my dad went up, and he was already a little bit miffed, because why would they sell a beautiful bicycle like that with no brakes? What do they expect? Kids are going to get killed. He was really upset, but he was upset because he's protective of me, you know. So he goes walking up to the guy up there, and my dad already had a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, you know. The guy says, "Can we help you?" My dad says, "Yeah." He says, "See this bicycle here?" And he'd been walking the bicycle into the store. He says, "See this bicycle here? We bought this yesterday. I took all this time to put this bicycle together for my son." And he pointed at me. And he says, "It's got no brakes." Guy says, well, the guy was very mild-tempered. He says, we'll see what we can do. My dad looks at him in the eye, and my dad's one eye goes up a little bit, you know. And he says, "You'll do more than see what you can do." Because my dad was already mad. And the other guy locked eyes with him, you know, and the other guy says, okay, Mr. Travers, we'll see what we can do, really. We'll see what we can do. So they brought another box out, you know, with another bike in it. And my dad ripped the top of the box open and reached in and grabbed the critical part, which was the part where the pedal was, you know, where the brake was. And he tried it. He looks up at the guy, and he got really cross, my dad did. And he says, this one's the same. It doesn't work either. What are you guys trying to do in here? He says, and the guy, the Sears guy, his eyes opened up big, and he was like, well, what do you mean, Mr. Travers? He says, are you guys trying to sell defective bicycles to poor little children that are going to get run over by trucks? My dad was mad, you know. And he says, well, Mr. Travers, I'm sure they're not all defective. Here's one on the rack right here. You know, that's the display model, he said. Try it out and see how it is. So my dad got in the store, quite literally, got on top of this little display model bicycle and rode it up and down the aisle and tried it. And the brake worked. It worked beautifully. My dad rolled up to a stop in front of the guy. And he says, listen. He says, this is our bicycle. He says, I'm taking this one. This one works. And the fellow in the store, he's like, okay, Mr. Travers, you can do whatever you want. It's like so, wheeled the bicycle out of the store, the one that worked good. And I'm going to tell you something. That brake on that bicycle worked good. All those years I drove it, it never failed. It worked beautifully, the display model one. But from what I gather, all the ones that were in the boxes that were for sale had defective brakes. And that's probably why they were on clear-out sale. That's probably why they were cheap. Anyway, listen, thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next show. Bye-bye, guys.